settled out of court.
Honeywell gave us $35,000. The U.S. government gave us $35,000. We took the Honeywell money, sent it to an American Friends Service Committee, Shovels for Laos project.
You also are on Alliant property. I am a representative. If you don't leave the property now, you will be arrested.
The demonstrations continued, and finally, after nearly 3 decades of protest, this plant stopped making cluster bombs. Still, the production and use of cluster bombs is spreading. Recently, they were used in Kosovo by NATO.
For some extraordinary reason, having stated that the major objective of the NATO air campaign was to get people back to their homes safely, they then used a weapon. Both the US and the RAF, the UK Air Force, used a weapon that they knew was going to actually cause a problem for people returning home. And that's exactly what it's doing. 40 to 50% of the casualties caused to the people who've returned, the returned refugees, are caused by cluster bombs.
At first, bomb disposal teams in Laos focused on destroying unexploded ordnance located above ground in places where people live, in towns and villages. But Laos is lucky to have extremely fertile farmland, and now the bomb disposal teams have started working here, so farmers can safely use it. Because farmers dig and plow the earth, the search for bombies must go below the surface. It's a dangerous and painstaking process. Every reading on the detector must be gently exposed. Every inch of ground must be carefully checked and rechecked. Often the day's take is nothing more than old bullet shells, rusty nails, and odd bits of bomb frag. But sometimes the results are more threatening.
Langsamer, langsamer, langsamer. Nicht so doll rankratzen von der Seite.
It's slow, demanding work. To clear a field this size could take many months. October 30th, 1968. President Lyndon Johnson calls for a halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and is hailed for his dramatic effort to bring peace.
I have now ordered that all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease.
Laos was a different story. The bombers formerly targeted against North Vietnam were now redirected against Laos, which felt the full might of American air power. The number of bombing missions increased from 300 a month to nearly 13,000. Tens of thousands of villagers fled the onslaught and became refugees, an event that would eventually lead to exposing the secret war. Fred Brantman had been in Laos for 2 years, working for the U.S. government as an educational advisor. He lived in a village near Vientiane, the capital, learned to speak Lao, and grew to love and respect the local culture.
September 1969, the first week of September, there was a day that changed my life forever.
Fred learned that thousands of refugees were flooding into the capital. Foreign news media were anxious to get their story, but needed Fred's interpreting skills. Month after month, he spoke with the refugees.
I estimated at one point that I had interviewed over 2,000 Laotians. Every single one, without exception, said that his or her village had been destroyed by bombing. But the worst part of it, the absolute worst part of it, was knowing that 100 miles away, Laotians who were now alive would be dead by the next day because the bombing was continuing. As I was interviewing these refugees, the bombing was continuing.
Sien Quan in northern Laos was one of the places hit the hardest. In the surrounding hills were large caves, like this one, where old people, women, and children sought shelter. Once a year, Bun Kam makes the long climb up to Pyu Cave, where his wife and 3 daughters lived during the war. For 5 years, this cave had protected his whole village from American bombs. One day, even the cave wasn't protection enough.
จังสั้นแต่แม่ขลาดมายิงเวลานั้นหมายความมีเงินแอดนั่นเนี่ยแอดสิฮัตแต่มันว่า4 คันคันที่1หมายความยิงบ่ถึกคันที่2ยิงก็บ่ถึกคันที่3ยิงก็บ่ถึกคันที่4หมายความว่าลูกศรไฟจะมาตกอยู่บ่อนนี้หมายความว่ามันแตกอยู่บ่อนนี้รวมทั้งหมดป่าชนอยู่อ้อมข้างแล้วมาตายอยู่ถ้ำเนี่ยเป็น473
The heat from the blast was so intense it took 3 days before Buencam could enter the cave. The charred remains were unidentifiable. Because of the flames, it was too dangerous to bury the dead outside and perform proper rites. Even now, over 30 years later, he still finds bones.
มนุษย์มาไหว้มากินมาทำช่วงไปวัดไปเทิงก็เทิงสาธุสาธุอย่างตลอดเวรตลอดคืนบ่มีเวลาจะลงเลยจากบ่อนหั่นความเครียดแนวคิดเครียดแค้นความมาต่ออเมริกาความที่ฟันฆ่าประชาชนที่บ่มีโทษกรรมยังความมาบาทเดียวเนี่ยมันอย่างดวงได้
Basically, we had no information about bombing. The U.S. at that point said that we had never dropped a bomb in Laos. That was the official U.S. position. I just became consumed with I had to understand how this had happened. So I began going to air bases in Thailand and eventually in South Vietnam and interviewing dissident Air Force personnel.
Fred gathered details about the secret war and then went to Washington, where he spoke at a special session of the Senate Committee on Refugees.
There's a good deal of evidence to suggest that the United States has been carrying out the most protracted bombing of civilian targets in history in Laos, that it's violated its own rules of engagement, which say that undefended civilian villages or even defended civilian villages cannot be bombed.
I felt in order to live on this earth, I had to devote every waking hour to stopping the bombing.
Fred went on the road, spreading the word about the secret war and bombies.
The Cornell Air War Study Project estimates the United States has flown 500,000 sorties in Laos. The majority are these kinds of anti-personnel bombs. This is only one kind, it's the pineapple.
According to Senator Ted Kennedy, the bombing helped create over 500,000 refugees.
And the conclusions of our hearings and our reports from our study in the United States Senate is that between 75 and 80% of the refugees are created because of bombing raids in Laos.
As the facts emerged about the secret war, the Senate began to react.
It is incredible that a great nation such as ours could be waging a major military operation in a foreign country without the knowledge either of its citizens or of its Congress.
Well, I regret to see our country violating the Geneva Agreement. The fact that the North Vietnamese has violated it does not excuse us for violating it. We signed the agreement quite solemnly. We should keep the agreement.
We dropped 2 million tons of bombs on Laos, 2 tons of bombs for every man, woman, and child living in Pathet Lao zones, which was horrifying enough. But I think the single most horrifying aspect of this air war against Laos was this widespread use of bombies, because they were only designed to kill people. They weren't designed to kill tanks, trucks. And the use of them was primarily against civilians in the end. The last people we could ever find were the soldiers. So I believe the bombie is maybe the preeminent symbol of humans' inhumanity to other humans.
The war in Laos was an extraordinary period of time for the United States government. We tried many different technologies. We never really understood the enemy. We created a great deal of turmoil and destruction, both socially and physically in Laos. I think one of the lessons from the war, therefore, is that if you try and use bombing, you probably should think about the long-term consequences of that, particularly with these bombies or the CBUs that are now in Laos, because these are physically going to be there long after the war has ended.
Cluster bombs that are dropped and fail to explode are a spreading problem. A new generation of cluster bombs has been used in Kuwait, Iraq, the Falklands, Ethiopia, the Sudan, Sierra Leone, Chechnya, Kosovo, and like in Laos, they keep killing civilians long after the last bomb has been dropped.
The immediate thing that should happen now about cluster bombs is there must be a moratorium just to stop while everybody takes a proper look at them. That should happen now. And then my feeling is that when people become aware of the damage that these weapons are doing and the damage they're going to do in the future, there will be a ban.
At the present rate of demolition, it will be many, many more decades until Lao villagers are safe from bombies.
Funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the Rogers Documentary Fund.